Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And that was the Ospreys welcoming us to another week here at Mystery Island. Of course, they're sending their greetings in by remote since they are down in South America somewhere about now. I'm not sure exactly where the guys are, but they are kind enough to send us their greetings every show. So, welcome to our home of screaming ospreys, as we have been called in the past. And we are also a McDuff. McDuff lives. Why McDuff? Because McDuff is this guy here, oops, over there, this shoulder. That's my dad. And we've told a lot of stories about my dad, his amazing career. It's recorded in my book, McDuff Lives. And I happen to have a copy of that right here, so you can see, and you can get your own for, I think it's only $10 on Amazon. It's even cheaper on Kindle, so don't hesitate to get a copy. It's about a 3-hour read and tells the story of an amazing man who my dad, Thomas F. O'Loughlin Jr., we call him McDuff around here just to kind of keep it interesting and to also to think of that Shakespearean character that says lead on when Macbeth says lead on Macduff, and Macduff takes over and slays the bad king and leads a good future, restoring the correct order to the kingdom, to Scotland, to the United States, to the world. Well, this show here is about the world order, and we've been developing our history here as we study the life and times of my dad. And one of the things that um, we notice is that during his lifetime, during his career at the Pentagon from 62 to 71, there's a transition in which the old services are being weeded out, and the special ops and united services are being promoted, so that now all of our bases say things like Joint Base Andrews for Andrews Air Force Base, JBAB for Joint Base at Bowling Air Force Base. And to make things even more confusing, they're changing the names of most of the Army bases in Virginia now. Fort A.P. Hill is now Fort Walker. Fort Walker, named after the only female winner of the Medal of Honor, a female surgeon in the Civil War. And interesting to do the history and look into the new names that are being put on the posts that formerly honored the Southern commanders in the Civil War. But we're talking about the 20th century now, and right at the beginning of the 20th century, we had an interesting crisis called Y2K. Beginning of the 21st century, you know what I mean. The Y2K crisis. Let me open up the comments and see if anybody remembers the Y2K process. Put yes in the comments so I know you're with me. This story kind of starts there because this man, Thomas PM Barnett, was part of the Pentagon planning around Y2K. All right, Daisy Dan remembers K. So what it was, and there's a great Sean Connery movie about it too, about how they planned this robbery around the computer glitch that supposedly was going to happen as the century turned over. That somehow whoever programmed the great computer clocks forgot that there was going to be a zero somewhere, and that this was going to cause a major disturbance in the world, not only in the computer but in everything else. There's going to be these following events, things like the hospitals couldn't work, so that we got more emergency cases, and the schools shut down for 5 days, so that caused this and that, and systems break down, supply chain events. And that was what Thomas PM Barnett was working on. Um, let me give you just a little taste of that, if I can pick up the right one. Let's see, is this it? Yeah, this is the one. Now, the book I'm talking about was was published in 2004. So this is the 20th year anniversary of the publishing of the book, The Pentagon's New Map. But let me first bring your attention to something that Thomas P.M. Barnett wrote in 2020, published Friday, March 13th, 2020. And I want to show this to you on the screen so you can see what this is about. Just hang on a second. I got to push the right button. There it is. Okay, so this is Thomas P.M. Barnett's blog, and you can find that at squarespace.com. Anyway, this is what he wrote on March 13th, 2020. It was a Friday the 13th, just like last Friday was. An internet meme chart on coronavirus that reminds me of Y2K modeling from way back when. Here's the chart. And it's just a chart, okay? It's just, but you see what it has two bulges. The number of cases, and then it says in red, without protective measures. And then as time goes along the horizontal axis, protective measures come in, the healthcare system capacity is met. That means maxed out. And then it goes down. Everything disappears. Well, that's not the model that we've been using for our current pandemic, but it's what it is, a model that was current in 2020. And he picks up on it and says, this reminds me of what we did at the Pentagon getting ready for Y2K. And he says, well, when I saw it, I thought that looks a lot like the charts I did way back when I ran a series of high-level U.S. government workshops at the Naval War College and elsewhere, like World Trade Center 1 for the DoD. And then he describes first the notion of generically modeling the event, a process view of Y2K. The event will feature a distinct build-up phase already begun, a peak period, which we consider the crisis, and an end phase in which the crisis unwinds, either by on its own accord or more likely by decree. Either governments will declare that the crisis has passed, or some other crisis will arise and capture our attention. Slide 2 below presents another way of thinking through the process of Y2K's build-up and unfolding and end. And so here you see this graph, and you're just seeing the bulge part, but okay. So something network instability failures, right? The old rules. And the old rules are a little rocky because we know we have a little failure here and there, but gradually things get worse and worse, and we cross some unknown threshold. And when we cross this unknown threshold, and this is key to Barnett's thinking, then you have the opportunity or the necessity of crafting a new rule set. And that's where he writes new rules up at the top of that. Then after it goes down, and then, the question is, well, what's going to happen next? And this essay goes on and on and on to thresh out this theory that he's just presented as he's considering the very beginning of the coronavirus crisis in March 2020 and reflecting upon what he did at the Pentagon at a very high level, and I mean at the Rumsfeld level, okay, for showing what the Pentagon's future ought to be, according to Barnett. And you can believe that when Barnett's selling it, he's selling it to Rumsfeld because that's what Rumsfeld wants, right? Okay, let me get back to some other stuff. So now let's look at the primary source of his book, which is an essay that he gave at the Naval War College. And I'm going to skip through all the introductions because we just want to save the time. But let me get it up on the screen. And we'll begin with him giving you a riddle and then solving it for you in a way that I hope sticks with you, because this is the whole theme of the Pentagon's new map. And it's quite, well, I'll let you react yourselves to it. Okay.
I like to think of myself as a stand-up philosopher. That was actually the description I offered that lady from the Newport Daily News. She didn't get it. I said, stand-up philosopher. I coalesce the vapors of human existence into a coherent comprehension. A bullshit artist, basically. This is the actual joke that Phil Hartman gave to Jay Leno the last time he appeared on The Tonight Show in 1999 before he died. I use it because it gives you a sense of the goal of my talk here tonight. Over the next 60 minutes, what I want to accomplish is basically the answer to the question, what did Buddha say to the hot dog vendor? I'll tell you what Buddha said to the hot dog vendor. Make me one with everything. That's what we're shooting for.
All right, that's what we're shooting for. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about, the fifth generation warfare, or however we want to phrase it. Where did all these things come from? Well, what he's going to describe to you is how we were in the pre-9/11 era, and then how 9/11 becomes the real transformative event that he was modeling for the Pentagon in anticipation of the Y2K crisis. Now, if your spidey sense is starting to tingle, then you're with me, because I think this whole Y2K crisis was made up. This is just me, okay? But I think that this whole Y2K crisis was an exercise from start to finish, that they knew that the computers of the world were not going to lose their ability to connect to each other just because of the century flipped over on the odometer. They used it as a way to model a systemic crash, an event that they could then use the actual data from to prepare for what? Well, maybe Donald Rumsfeld could have told us what was coming on 9/11. Maybe. Maybe Thomas PM Barnett can help us understand it some more. So let's get back to what he was saying and to continue.
The reason why it's important, from my perspective, to think as absolutely big picture about 9/11 is I think we got some serious signals about the future of change in the international security environment, about the nature of conflict in the international security environment. I think we got a big glimpse at the underlying struggles connected with the process of economic, political, social, technological globalization. I think it tells us a lot about where we need to take our military in terms of transformation. And I know this is a very difficult subject that a lot of people are struggling with. These are the best ideas I've been able to come up with in a series of conversations with about 40 or 50 individuals over the last 6 months. But this very much builds on really a 4 to 5 year conversation I've had with all those individuals I named earlier, and especially with Art Zabrowski. This began with the year 2000 International Security Dimension Project, when we asked, what would a big, scary event look and feel like for a network society? And you can go back and read that report. Amazingly, we predicted a lot of things that didn't happen on January 1st, 2000, but did happen the days and weeks following September 11th.
We predicted a lot of things that didn't happen on January 1st, 2000, but did happen on 9/11.
A sense of where we come from in terms of marching orders, we think we have, Art Zabrowski and I, from Don Rumsfeld. The basic notion we have is we got to move faster in the current, and the current is moving ever so fast right now. George Bush has said this several times. We must change the way we fight to win this war. Ergo, this war allows us to change the way we fight.
Okay, I'm just saying, when you hear things like that, let it resonate through the past 20 years and see what they've done is we have used 9/11 as a pivotal event that allows them to change the rule set that they talk about.
Donald Rumsfeld's op-ed, November 1st, Washington Post, Beyond This War on Terrorism. He laid down 2 markers. He said, first, obviously, we got to win this war. Second, we got to start preparing for the next. And you got to remember, this is when the op-ed pundits were nipping at his heels, saying he didn't realize what he'd gotten us into in Afghanistan. This is before it all turned. So it was a big point on his part to lay down this marker and say, not only do we fight this war, but we have to understand what this war tells us about the future and begin constructing that kind of architecture now. So I say military transformation pathway, somewhat sharpened. Near term, you go with what you got in the pipeline. You get rid of that concept of low density, high use. But long term, you start asking yourself, what has this experience taught us about a security environment that we may be living with for decades? We exported security into Europe, into Japan for 40 or 50 years. And by doing so, we solved 2 of the biggest security issues of the 20th century: German militarism, Japan militarism. By exporting that security for half a century, we took care of the 3rd big problem of the 20th century, Russian aggression. The question is, what do we want to take care of in this century? What are the big goals we want to achieve? The historical analogies, you've seen these before. We compare, win this one to 1941. People like to compare the World Trade Center attacks to Pearl Harbor in terms of the shock. Obviously not the same mobilization. We're a different society now. But in terms of the shock, the same wake-up call that says, hey, pay attention to things you haven't been paying attention to, we think it's very similar. But when we're talking about win the next one, here we have to make the leap. Here we have to engage in the kind of thinking that those wise men engaged in at the end of the Second World War, when they looked ahead and said, hey, what do we want to have 40, 50 years down the road? We know.
All right, now who are these wise men in 1945 to 50, but the people we've been talking about all along? You know, we're talking about the Dulles brothers. It's the wise men. You know, we're talking about Averell Harriman. We're talking about the Forrestal, and we're talking about the people that come from Wall Street and are manipulating our government to favor the clients. And that is who I think of as the so-called wise ones. They were wise for their own pockets. So anyway, they laid it out. This is the world that was still there when my dad was alive. the world that the Dulles brothers built, the Sullivan and Cromwell built. And that world is now the world of the secret stuff behind our government today. And it's in both sides. It's not just in the Republicans or the Democrats or anywhere else. Everywhere, because as you understand the joke, the goal is to be one with everything.
We want to wait out a Soviet Union. We know we want to rebuild a global economy. We know we want to focus on Western Europe and Japan and North America. And they made that dream come true. And they created a national security establishment to facilitate that dream. And so the questions we ask are really about, how do you get between those two numbers? Those are huge dates in American history. I've been reading a lot of Stephen Ambrose to cover the time period. It goes kind of fast because he doesn't use a lot of footnotes, I found out. I've since switched to Shelby Foote. He's really terrible. He has lots of footnotes on the Civil War. But the kind of questions we ask to jump from 41 to 45. What are the new rules for international security? What's the best security structure for this government? What is the definition of new normalcy for U.S. society? Do we travel as far as a London, perhaps, which after the IRA bombings of the 1970s and 80s, basically erected a structure where today you can walk from one end of London to the other and be on camera the entire time?
All right, now let's make sure we catch that point. Already in 2002 in London, Thomas PM Barnett is reporting that they have surveillance everywhere. You can walk from one end of London to the other and be on camera the whole time. And of course, it's only multiplied, 1,000-fold since then. He's asking the question, do Americans want to go that far? And guess what? They are pushing the boundaries. They're pushing and pushing and pushing. And, that's where we're talking about the technocratic state, the totalitarian control through technocracy, through satellites and radar beams and lasers and radio and skull-to-head brain to transmissions and all of this craziness. It's all part of the Pentagon saying we've got to stop just fighting the big wars, and we've got to move to a multiple disciplinary concept of war that includes everything, totally everything. Make me, the Pentagon, one with everything.
Or do we travel as far as in Israel, where you take your kids to the mall on a Saturday, and while they check out the latest DVDs, you have the gas masks, the family gas masks, refreshed? How far are we willing to travel? How much can we take in terms of a different kind of normalcy? A lot of people think we're watching the future of warfare, the future of terrorism right now in the West Bank and in Israel. A sense of this concept of rule sets and how we've defined it. I drew this slide with Art Zabrowski 4 years ago. When we first started briefing this, people said, wow, you guys are a little apocalyptic, bit of a messiah complex. To which I always responded, your point? I like to say I live in the greatest country in the world. I work for the best government in the world. I'm associated with the best military in the world. I'm employed by the best military higher education institution in the world. I don't walk through these doors each and every day to collect a paycheck or a pension. I walk through these doors to change the world each and every day. So you bet I have a messiah complex.
So you bet he has a messiah complex. You bet that he has an ego that knows no bounds. It's almost like he's a walking DARPA or something. He's just going to press every boundary that he can, and he's put together these he's a really good, I think he's a really good speaker, a good talker. He's selling this to the top level of the Pentagon and to the administration, Rumsfeld. So what are his new rules for, of course, we have the new world order, and we have the rules-based world that's a lot of people talk about, like, oh, well, you have to be part of the rules-based world. Where'd that come from? Come from Thomas PM Barnett.
Here's how I explain the 20th century in 60 seconds. Pay attention. People say watching me give a brief is like watching a farmer try to stuff 30 pounds of manure into a 10-pound bag. I'm going to talk about globalization 1, roughly from 1875 to 1929, when I can say somewhat facetiously, we screwed the pooch one afternoon on Wall Street. We called it Black Friday. We engendered a systemic stress. We called that the Great Depression. From the Great Depression came World War II. Why? You don't get a Hitler elected in Germany in 1933 without the Great Depression. At the end of World War II, we said we were going to firewall ourselves off from that experience. Not just the Holocaust, never again, but the economic nationalism of the 1930s, which killed this first great coming together of the global economy. We instituted what we describe as a new rule set. We created institutions, strategies, flows of resources. The International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which becomes the WTO, the United Nations, NATO, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the whole shebang, Marshall Plan, containment, all designed to keep the Western democracies talking to one another, prevent the Soviet bloc from dividing and conquering us. But the implicit goal was the resurrection of the global economy. We succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Larry Summers, now president of Harvard, will say, that's the story of the second half of the 20th century. Not the Cold War. That was an enabling factor, a crucial factor. But the real accomplishment, the real peace dividend of that time period was the recreation of the global economy based on Japan, Western Europe, the United States. 10% of the global population, 70% global GDP, 70% long-term investment flows around the world. Absolutely amazing.
And I'm just going to say it is amazing, but when you think about it, this is the product of the hidden wealth stolen by the fascists and the Nazis during the war, being recycled through things like the Bilderberg Group. And it's not because of any inherent genius in the economy of the United States, West Germany, or Japan. That's the way I see it. But you can see, Thomas PM Barnett, he drinks all the Kool-Aid, whatever is handed to him. He accepts, man-made global warming. Oh yeah, got it, no problem. Osama bin Laden is a radical, unique, crazy man, wild actor. Okay, got it, accept that, yeah. And of course, there's no false flags, right? Let's keep going. Globalization 2 has been a great success, according to Thomas PM Barnett.
They envisioned a world, they created a security structure, they developed a strategy, they followed it, they changed the world. I think we're at a similar point in history. When we first drew this slide, we started to ask. The Berlin Wall comes down, seemingly everybody, all of a sudden, 1990, on the same page, adopting the same rule set regarding economic behavior and activity. We start to ask ourselves, do new sorts of stresses begin to appear in the 1990s, which begin to call into question what was a new rule set for the late 1940s, early 1950s, now starts to look a little long in the tooth, because that rule set was created to prevent the collapse of this sort of globalization, prevent this sort of great power war paradigm, not to further the advance of this sort of globalization, which I would argue is qualitatively, quantitatively different. Labor much more rigid in terms of flow. Money much more fluid, for example. First big hint I had, new stress. Mexican pesos crisis, 1994. I was working for CNA at the time, Center for Naval Analyses. I sent a memo to Bob Murray, the president. I said, I don't know what it is. I just think it's really important. And that was enough for my paycheck that week. Other big hints. The Asian flu, 97, 98. the rise of rapid climate change, the rise of global computer viruses. When we first drew this slide, we said, what could come down the pike? And this is where people said we were kind of apocalyptic. It would be like a World War II, where we would find ourselves firewalling ourselves off from some wilder, earlier experience. The analogy, 1990s, 1920s. Try selling that in 1998. Business cycle, the law of the business cycle at that point had been repealed. Everybody had gotten 30% on their mutual funds for so long they forgot you could ever have a depression. This was before Enron, before all the scandals. Now, when we first drew this slide, we drew it for Y2K. We wondered if that could be a catalytic event. Then we became interested in the tech crash. With 9/11, I got no problem drawing this line. If you're reading the newspaper every day, you are seeing new rule sets being proposed all the time for how we interact as citizens, for the nature of privacy, for the nature of warfare, for the nature of legal rights in this system. Most of these rule sets are not being put up for a vote. They will.
All right. Most of these rule sets are not being put up for a vote, folks. The new rule set is there because we've had a 9/11. You know, the truth behind 9/11 is still not been revealed. I don't know if it ever will be, but the way that it has been told to us is exactly the way it would fit into such a monumental watershed event that perhaps they can get their new rule set past us this time. So look how much Pentagon planning there was for Y2K, and now how convenient it was when they had the models already there to evaluate what happens after 9/11.
Will be tested in court for decades. But your whole world is changing on the basis of 9/11. It's pinging all the boxes, rule sets appearing daily. But it's not just enough to focus on closing the door on those crazy, hazy 1990s, when in effect we got a little sleepy at the wheel. We really have to back this thing down and ask ourselves, what are we trying to create as we look ahead to the next century? What future do we seek? What do I want to see in 2050? I'll be 88 years old. At that point, I will have remanufactured, reseeded, replaced, regrown most of my body parts. I'll be looking at the second half of my life, most of which I don't intend to spend on this dusty planet. But what do we want to seek? The concept of asymmetrical warfare. It's used, abused, employed all the time. Here's my take on it. I'm going to give you a three-tiered paradigm for looking at an essential question of human history. Why are wars caused between states? I'm citing Ken Waltz, classic of international relations theory, Man, the State, and War. He developed a three-tiered perspective looking at the issue nation-state war. He said, I'll look at it sort of from the bottom up. I'll blame it. First image, he said, human nature. Man's inherently violent. You have bad leaders, a Hitler, a Milosevic, a Saddam. That's why you have wars. First explanation. Second explanation. You say you have good states, bad states. Democracies on average start wars less. Authoritarian governments on average start wars more. Actually, governments going from authoritarian to democracy start wars the most. It's sort of a teenagerdom for states. Tom Friedman came up with this genius concept not too long ago, about 4 or 5 years ago. He said, I realized that no two countries with a McDonald's franchise within their borders had ever gone to war in human history. He dubbed it the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. He went to McDonald's. They have databases on everything at their headquarters in Chicago, and they said, you're absolutely right. So he publishes his very famous book describing globalization, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. And he says no two countries in human history have ever gone to war if they have a McDonald's franchise within their borders. Absolutely true. Until NATO bombed Serbia. Tom Friedman came out with a new edition. Slightly enlarged chapter. He said, read the fine print. I said, civil wars don't count. Yugoslavia, civil war. NATO, he said, not a country.
NATO, not a country,
Smart.
right?
I sent Mr. Friedman an email. I said, I've been to the McDonald's in Belgrade. It was the worst Big Mac I ever had. I don't think it counts. Here's a better one for you military officers. I got this off an airplane one time, Golf Digest. No two countries with more than 100 golf courses per 1 million people have ever gone to war in human history. Look it up, believe it. This island should be the center of world peace. I gave this brief to a bunch of military flags, Marine Corps generals. One of them leaned over the table. He said, "That's the Air Force strategy for ruling the world." All these things say the same thing. You get to a society to a certain level of socioeconomic development, they tend to get out of the violence game. I can count 37 major crises or conflicts in the 1990s. You look them up in terms of their per capita GDP, you will find that all of them, except for a couple, Northern Ireland, the Chiapas revolutionaries in Mexico, all of them are low income or low middle income. You get a country above $3,000 per capita per year, they get out of the violence business.
So isn't it just so telling when Thomas PM Barnett says that the way countries can get out of the violence business is to engage in more McDonald's and more golf courses. And the idea, of course, is, well, once you get to the point where you can eat, at fast food and you can play golf fairly often and afford it, then you don't want to mess around with, dirty things like war and all. But it's only these poor people, these ones in what he's going to call later in his talk the gap, that are the ones that seem to stir up these wars. That's the attitude that we have from our Pentagon in 2002, and I suspect that it's still there.
And I've done a lot of consulting with USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, over the course of my career. I will tell you the simplest way to get that to happen: educate young girls, stop them from having kids early in life. And boom, they're out of the violence business. You go up on top here, you say, the reason why we have conflict in the system is there's no Leviathan stopping states from going to war. Kind of explains my children every time I turn my back on them. Like Thomas Hobbes' description of life without a Leviathan, they're rather nasty, brutish, and short. Constantly fighting till I step in. Okay, we take this three-tiered perspective. We look at the nature of globalization. The basic argument I've been making for a long time: militaries tend to be frozen in the nation-state image. When they look around the world, all they see are nation-states. I call this the Willie Sutton effect. Willie Sutton was the bank robber who was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" He said, "That's where the money is." Smart. The reason why militaries look around the world and only see nation-states is because that's where the money is. Concentrated in the forms of levies, taxes, whatever, to create the instruments of big violence we call the military. The problem is, most of the power and competition have moved up to the interstate level. Most of the violence and the threats have moved subnational. Global defense spending by countries peaked in 1987, dropped 40% almost immediately with the Berlin Wall, flat ever since. Same thing with global arms transfers. Meanwhile, acquisition of small arms around the world skyrocket. 500 million small arms in the world, according to the UN. Good news is 200 million right here on American streets. So we win that arms race too. It's good to be rich. But we're talking about all the private security firms down here. We're talking about all the massive efforts to create secure lines of communication, all those financial markets around the world. I could argue we're spending as much on security, probably more, than we did in 1987. We're just not concentrating the activity so much at the level of the government. Private security industry in this country, $25 billion a year. It is growing leaps and bounds. Before I die, it'll be bigger than the Defense Department. Absolutely. Meanwhile, we spent most of the 90s fixating on those rogues, those 5 states: Libya, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and their access to WMD. Certainly an important issue. You stack those 5 economies end to end, though, you don't have much of a picture of globalization. You're staring at a tiny corner of the world Frankly, it wouldn't matter at all if it wasn't for the natural gas and the oil in Iraq and Iran. So we say, in effect, we got a military that's built for fighting other nations. But the market of security has gotten so much more fractured. National Defense University, in their landmark study on globalization, they describe this as the governance gap. You're built for one kind of governance structure, but the market's gotten so much more complex. Some of the reasons why this governance gap has appeared. So what did we see on 9/11? We talk about the super-empowered individual. That's Tom Friedman's concept, Lexus and the Olive Tree. He named bin Laden as the super-empowered individual. Bin Laden, when he declared war on America in 1996, he didn't declare war on the United States. He declared war on American citizens. He said, I want to kill as many American citizens as possible. And he did it on 9/11, sending suicide bombers, killing the largest number of Americans since the Battle of Antietam, the second day, Sharpsburg. That's how long it's been since that many Americans died. And the best part was we all got to watch it live on television, because that's the way they planned it. They wanted all of us to watch 3,000 or 4,000 people die live on television. Up on top here, we got a transnational network, Al-Qaeda. They're not interested in taking us on directly. They want to trigger a systemic perturbation. They attack the icons of globalization. My New Rule Sets project, it was all about bringing the Pentagon and the World Trade Center together. The partner was Cantor Fitzgerald. The project shot out from under me, literally on 9/11, because most of the people connected with it are dead now. They were trying to attack symbols of what we represent. And they did an amazing job. Now you can cynically draw a line between these two and say, thank God it ran through Afghanistan. Nobody liked those people anyway. So the knee-jerk response, bomb them. But of course it's a lot more complex than that. We're fighting a network war all across the world against these guys. Bank account by bank account, US Treasury jump teams, FBI, the whole package. They've taken $100 million off the table from about 200 groups or individuals. This is a major new form of warfare. Treasury didn't do this before. Nothing like this. Down here, we're talking all the special operations, cave by cave. FBI guys running in with SEALs and Green Berets. Amazing stuff. Very integrated, all parts of the US government working. We have not seen this kind of warfare before. Don Rumsfeld will tell you flat out, no op plan for this. No plan on the shelf to do this package. Nobody imagined this package. Frankly, we did on Y2K, and we were accused of being nuts for it. But we were talking about what happens when a real shock happens to a network society like the United States. That's what we were groping for. Blindly, frankly. So when I talk about this fractured market, when I describe these concepts, especially this concept I'm going to talk about in depth, the system perturbation, in many ways, I'm searching for a gut, a grand unifying theory that ties together asymmetrical warfare, virtual warfare, cyber warfare, military operations other than war, the whole shebang. We're trying to create a new language. We are trying to reinvent the wheel. Battle lines in this war. People may be surprised at the level of energy, resources we're going to pour into Central and Southwest Asia over the next 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 years. I will tell you, this started long ago. In the 1950s and 1960s, our deployments and our crisis response patterns were in sync. We were all about making sure the Soviets didn't expand. So we had troops and we had crisis response activity in Europe. We had troops, and we had crisis response activity in Northeast Asia. It was called the Korean War. It was called the Vietnamese War. Okay? Come the 1970s, everything starts to change. This is when this whole show began. 4 big events. First, you got the détente in Europe. You got the 73 war. I can show you the crisis response data from EUCOM, European Command. It shifts right to the Eastern Med over the 1970s. You got the end of the Vietnam War. You got the fall of the Shah of Iran, a pivotal event in that century's history, I would argue. And I can show you the data from PACOM, Pacific Command. They used to have lots of responses on that side. Then they all started shifting over to the Middle East. By the time you got to the 1980s, that's the bulk of the security market. There was no surprise when they created CENTCOM. The market had simply migrated there. Naval response crisis days, count them up in the 1980s. 3 out of every 4 focused on the Middle East. That's 75% of your market. We were still very much focused on the Soviets at this point, but that's where the market had gone. All the signals were there. Bush administration came in, very much focused on, we're going to get much tougher on China. We're going to look at them at the near peer. We're going to reorient a security strategy towards Northeast Asia. All that gets wiped away with 9/11. And I say, good. I'm going to draw you a map of the world. I will tell you, this is a map that got the most interest from Rumsfeld's deputies about a month ago when I gave a brief to them in SecDef's conference room. And it was really intriguing to me why they were so interested in this. People refer to this as the jelly donut slide. I'm going to draw you a map of the world that's different from most people's maps. I'm going to describe parts of the world that are functioning within the process of globalization. That means they accept both the connectivity of globalization and they can handle the content flows that come with it. All the Britney Spears, all the commercial pornography, the whole shebang, they can handle it because they got legal systems, they got mature societies that can handle nasty stuff in effect. Functioning within globalization doesn't mean every day sweet and happy, doesn't mean they don't have recessions, it means they're not fighting globalization. They're aligning their internal rule sets with the external global rule set represented by globalization. Those functioning areas, North America, Europe definitely. I would include Russia under a Putin, coastal areas of China, obviously South Korea, Japan. I'd include India, half the world's software. I'd include Australia. I'd include South Africa. I'd include the Southern Cone, the ABC countries of South America, although, of course, Argentina having a bit of an Enron moment right now. But they should have known they couldn't have gotten away with it for too long. I draw a big circle around that. I say that's the functioning core. I could show you a great map from the New York Times last Sunday. What I just drew you, all those countries, 10 to 25% of the population over 60. Okay, remember that, 10 to 25% of the population over 60, that functioning core. Now I'm going to draw you the messy middle. I first drew this messy middle on the basis of tracking U.S. naval crisis responses in the 1990s. Non-combat evacuations, relief, contingency positioning, show of force, combat. This is where we did our business in the 1990s. I said I'm going to draw a line around 90% of it. I'm not going to include what I think are rather isolated cases in Northeast Asia. A little bit of scary business, virtual warfare off the coast of Taiwan, North Korea acting up now and then. I'm going to include that as my messy middle, and I'm going to call that the non-integrating gap. These are countries that are losing out to globalization, unable to keep up with globalization, can't handle the content flows that come with globalization. Like much of the Middle East, like much of Islamic society. So I say this is a different map of the world. What you discover is, if you're fighting against or losing out to globalization, this is where the US military tends to go. And if you're not fighting globalization, then you should be part of the solution set, because you're not the places we tend to go. So it becomes very clear to me when I look at 9/11, the nature of conflict, it's all about globalization. Remember I said the outer ring, 10 to 25%, 60 and over. That mess in the middle, less than 10%, 60 and over. It's a demographic breakdown. That's where the young are. This is where the older are. The concept of containment and how it switches or changes or is altered as we move from Cold War to globalization era. I'm going to make a basic argument here. It's kind of a Hegelian flip. In the Cold War, basically up on the system level, we had a fairly rigid bipolar order. Okay, we were concerned about zero-sum shifts against the United States. If they moved into country A, we had to move into country B. If they liked Ethiopia, we liked Somalia. If they decided they liked Somalia more, we switched over to Ethiopia. Back and forth, all around the world. Okay? What we were really concerned about, they expand their influence so much, in effect, our way of life is put at risk. They weren't just about expanding their empire, they were about eliminating our way of life. So in effect, I say we firewalled off that sacred thing. We fought these guys tooth and nail, country by country, system global competition throughout 50 years. Now I do the flip. Let's go to the globalization era. I think on 9/11, super-empowered individuals showed that they can affect serious zero-sum shifts against the United States. 19 guys, $500,000 in outlay. About $1 trillion of damage to the US and global economy. I say they changed world history in so many ways we're going to be counting up for decades. And I say if you think we licked the problem because we kicked them out of Afghanistan, don't kid yourself. I can raise $500,000 on credit cards in about 2 weeks. You give me 15, 20 young military officers willing to sacrifice their life, I could pull off the World Trade Center. I don't need Afghanistan to do that. That's the scary part about this. You got people willing to die on a little cash, and you're smart enough and patient enough, you can do some major damage. I say what we should really be concerned about is our way of life writ large. We cannot live the way we live without globalization. Don't kid yourself.
We cannot live the way we live without globalization. Don't kid yourself.
And I think we saw that in the Doha round, the meeting of the WTO and Qatar in December, where in effect they said, hey, we're going to firewall off globalization. You're not going to ruin this great process of human integration. We're going to make sure. So instead, we're going to fight individuals around the world, bank account by bank account, safe house by safe house, cave by cave. Very different warfare. And it changes the definitions of deterrence. In the Cold War, I would argue deterrence is fairly simple. It's us against the Russians. Basically, they were unwilling to risk regime control over their population. They thought time was on their side in a global conflict. They were unwilling to risk it all, single roll of the die, one afternoon. They were Marxist-Leninists. Very different now. How do you deter these rogues? That one seems pretty simple. We call it the Bush Doctrine. Harbor terror in any form, and eventually we're going to get around to you. But how do you deter the super-empowered individual? How do you deter the transnational network? How do you deter this guy when he doesn't have a regime to preserve? He's a real nihilist. How do you preserve these guys when they don't think time is on their side? The 17th century paradise these guys want to create in Saudi Arabia, they got a limited window of opportunity. Very limited, I could argue. You look at Saudi youth 20 years ago, you look at them today, you imagine Saudi youth in 20 years, that country won't be there in 20 years for them to turn back to the 17th century. They know it. That's why they're going to get more desperate. Definition of new crisis. I'm going to talk about vertical versus horizontal scenarios. This is something I learned at Hank Gaffney's side. These are basically his concepts originally. The vertical scenario that I learned about when I came to CNA in 1990. This is the classic military way of thinking. Vertical scenario. Something that just comes out of the sky, hits you one day. The descriptions. It unfolds with lightning speed. It's always completely without warning. Always. Opponents are known beforehand. We knew who they were. Allies were known beforehand. Very convenient. Strategy and battle plans published in thick volumes up on the shelf. Come as you are, no evolutions or change. Poland can't stand up in the middle of conflict and say, I'd like to switch sides. Not possible. Single hand of poker. Static time frame. The world will stay frozen. You'll fight it out, and then you'll figure out the change in the international security environment. This is the classic planning paradigm of the military when I came into this business, 1990. The classics of the genre, obviously, the Fulda Gap, and then the mini-me version, the DMZ in Korea, which we still have. Now let's talk about the 1990s and a very different beast that we encounter then. We call this the post-Cold War horizontal scenario. Rather than some dramatic thing that happens one day, it's this peaks and valleys mess that we keep dealing with. Sort of like my allergies. The description's here. No clear beginning or end. Drags on forever. Can anybody name the year the Balkans conflict began? I think it was 1262. Definition of who the enemy is changes over time. We went into Somalia, it was clear who the enemy was. It was famine. Then it was those nasty warlords. Then it was that one nasty warlord. Then it was the UN, and we got the hell out of there. Allies come and go, not just the French. That is always the biggest laugh. And I really like it. Strategy evolves, strikes, not battles. We saw that in Afghanistan. Definition of the problem, subject to whatever op-ed you're reading that morning.
The definition of the problem is subject to whatever op-ed you're reading that morning. Wow. So he's created in his mind a world that goes right along with the narrative, and he's selling it, the whole speech here. I won't play the rest of it just because I'm running out of time here at McDuff Lives this morning, but I really wanted to emphasize what he said, and that is that our way of life depends upon globalization, and that is the Pentagon saying it. And so when we look at things like, well, why is the Pentagon, involved in the military games where the illness comes? Why do we have military involvement in biowarfare? Why do we have all of these apparent incidents that look like, something that came from a pangolin or a guy from China, or it's just these things that really shouldn't turn into big transformational events, but they get turned into a way to change us. And, so from people that wouldn't normally take a jab unless it had been thoroughly tested over, however many years with, control groups and the formal series of tests, that no, we had a new rule set. And the new rule set was, if you don't take this jab, you're going to lose your job. And is all this really a response to these super empowered individuals like Osama bin Laden? Are we still going to buy that? I hope not. I hope we're past this kind of thinking, that we're somehow impelled, we have to go along with Gaza, we have to go along with the Ukraine war, because globalization is essential to maintaining the American way of life. And what we're saying, those of us that are observing this with horror, is that you are destroying the American way of life, just like you destroyed the villages in Vietnam in order to save them.